Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see everybody's in such good spirits here at the kickoff of 2023 for our Finance Committee. So I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 73 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, and pursuant to Standing Order 83.1 and the motion adopted on Wednesday, September 28, 2022, the committee is meeting to discuss pre-budget consultations in advance of the 2023 budget. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and the members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. So members, before we move on to our witnesses for today, you've received the subcommittee report from the clerk. It was emailed yesterday at 4:02 p.m. Just looking around, everybody received it? Yeah, everyone's in approval, great. Also, members, just a friendly reminder that the first list of PBC recommendations is due by 12 noon tomorrow. For the purposes of translation, we request members to prioritize the top 10 to 20 recommendations per party that are important to be considered for Tuesday. If you can do that, please. That'll help also with the analysts and their work, and then for also translation services. For subsequent meetings, members submit your second list of recommendations by 5 p.m. Monday, February 6, 2023. And submit your third and final list of recommendations by 5 p.m. on Thursday, February 9th, 2023. I would now like to welcome our witnesses that are before us, and they always say that the last thing you hear is the thing you remember most. So what an opportunity for our witnesses, because this will be our last meeting with witnesses for our pre-budget consultation. The witnesses have been all tested for today's meeting, those that are remote, those here in the room, and they've all passed the test, just for members' information. And with us today is the Aerospace Industries Association of Canada, Mike Mueller, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer. Welcome. From Campaign 2000, we have Leila Sarangi, who's the National Director. From Council of Canadian Innovators, Nicholas Schiavo, who's the Director of Federal Affairs. From the Fisheries Council of Canada, Paul Landsbergen, who is the President of the organization. And from the Hotel Association of Canada, Susie Grinnell, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer. And from Keystone Agriculture Producers, Jill Verwey, who's the President, and Colin Hornby, Manager of Communications and Stakeholder Relations. Well, thank you all for being here with us today. We now are going to open up to opening remarks, and we'll hear first from the Aerospace Industries Association of Canada. Mr. Mueller.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. It's great to be here in person. We've been doing these virtual the last few years, so first time for me in person. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here today to discuss AIC's key recommendations for the upcoming budget. As you may know, our members represent over 90% of aerospace activity in Canada, covering the civil, defense, and space sectors. At the outset, I would like to state our appreciation for the committee, including most of our recommendations in your report last year. I'll begin by speaking about our first recommendation, the development of a national aerospace strategy, which is critical for the prosperity and development of the aerospace industry in Canada. Just last spring, the Standing Committee on Industry and Technology also recommended the development of such a strategy. It's encouraging to see that the agreement that aerospace is an industry that is a priority for Canada. Today, we need to position aerospace as a priority because it is a key economic driver and requires the full support from all parties. If we are to keep what we have and grow this industry, With its high skill and good paying jobs, we need to ensure that the global aerospace supply chain recognizes that Canada has identified aerospace as a national priority. The global challenges and technological opportunities of the coming decades demand the very best of Canadian aerospace innovation, and a corresponding strategy with government is absolutely critical. Meeting net zero goals, reimagining air and space mobility, and safeguarding Canada's national interests are serious issues that require focused planning. That is why Canada needs such a comprehensive, forward-looking aerospace plan for civil aviation, defence, and space, a plan that reestablishes a collaborative partnership between industry and government, a plan that leverages our country's competitive advantages over other nations. We are also recommending the injection of resources to enhance Transport Canada's aeronautical certification capacity. The emergence of new technologies and the demands associated with Canada's commitment to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 means it is essential that certification capacity be able to support the new innovations that industry is pursuing. Transport Canada needs to grow the expertise and resources to sustain its international reputation for excellence and safeguard Canada's global competitiveness. On the defence side, we're recommending that the government consult with industry on NORAD modernization, as well as the defence policy review. Let's ensure companies based in Canada are benefiting and contributing their unique capabilities within the North America supply chains as we take significant steps to modernize and protect our sovereignty. We are also recommending that the government modify certain aspects of the Aerospace Regional Recovery Initiative and the Strategic Innovation Fund to enable more companies to access these innovation programs. We have also made representations on the challenges we see with the export control permit process and challenges we see across the country on the labour market side. So again, the priorities would be the need for an aerospace strategy, innovation ecosystem, Transport Canada resources, SIF and ARI changes, export permits, and then labour market challenges. I'd like to close by speaking about the select luxury items tax that came into effect on September 1st of last year. Despite some changes made by the government, which we thank them for, our members have seen orders cancelled in the last months, affecting sales and workers in the sector. We're not only talking about those who build the aircraft, but also the supply chain and post-production with the maintenance and repair operations. It's concerning that the government decided to implement this tax without any analysis of the impact on the industry or the workers. Because of the lack of financial analysis, industry commissioned an independent study through Professor Waugh of HAC Montreal that shows more than 2,000 jobs in the aerospace sector will be negatively affected, even more than industry had previously recognized. According to the research, the government will lose $2.9 million in tax revenues and only collect $9 million per year with this tax. The math here just does not make sense. And the impact of this tax on Canada's international reputation should not be overlooked, and also the resulting losses in foreign investment in Canada. Aircraft should be excluded from this tax, and we ask you, the committee, for your support with this request. This position is also shared by the unions representing these workers. It is clear that in the current form, this tax is hurting aerospace workers, hurting our economy, and the government needs to exclude aircraft from this tax. Thank you for your time, your support, and I welcome your questions.
Mr. Mueller, now we will hear from Campaign 2000, Ms. Sarangi, via video conference.
Hello, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today. Campaign 2000 is a pan-Canadian coalition, a nonpartisan pan-Canadian coalition of over 120 organizations working to end child and family poverty. We've been tracking and reporting on federal progress towards ending poverty for over 30 years. In our submission to this committee, we have made recommendations on how to make the Canada Child Benefit more powerful, how to get government transfers to low-income, marginalized people, including those who do not file personal income tax returns, and more, all of which are important. But today I'm going to focus my comments on the pandemic benefits, which Although not designed as poverty reduction programs, that's exactly the effect that they had. Temporary emergency and recovery benefits and one-time top-ups to existing income supports significantly reduced poverty and inequality in every jurisdiction across the country. Statistics Canada data shows that those who were more likely to receive temporary emergency benefits were low-income, women, Indigenous peoples, racialized people, and youth, who, for a brief moment, were lifted out of poverty. What that means is that families could pay rent and put enough food on the table without stress. Those benefits are over, long ago spent on basic needs, and families are now struggling with inflation and a pandemic that has not ended. The government is now pursuing these individuals and families for repayments and calling their approach compassionate. But everything that we've been hearing about this process is that it's causing real hardship. We're on a tour right now of the country, meeting with people living in poverty in every province and territory, and we're hearing a lot of these stories. In Whitehorse, I met a man who has a letter from the CRA. He's First Nation, on disability assistance, can't find paid work, but is a peer leader in his community. He can barely afford his medication right now, but he's being asked to pay $14,000 to the CRA. In Winnipeg, I met with a young woman who was in the child welfare system. She's working in a small peer-led organization and told me how she's being asked to repay the CERB. All of her money goes to her rent, and she doesn't have family to turn to and is now really worried about losing her apartment. In Ontario, I spoke with a woman on the Disability Support Program, which provides $1,228 a month to her. She was told to apply by the CERB for her to apply for the CERB by her caseworker. She squeezed $200 out of her budget to repay the CRA, but simply cannot afford anything more. Another gentleman, also on that disability program, called the CRA to get more information about his letter and was told on the phone that his disability tax credit would be garnished if he didn't enter into a repayment plan right then and there. He was so scared that he did, even though he can't afford it. And there's a public case that went through the federal courts that I recently read, and it demonstrates some of the unfairness that's inherent in these benefit designs. A woman who had applied in good faith for emergency benefits, it turned out that her workers' compensation did not count towards the threshold. So she ended up being $7.26 short of the $5,000 threshold, what the judge called achingly close to being eligible. That's about a half an hour's worth of additional work at the minimum wage, and she's being asked to repay the CRB in full. That there are federal expenditures in the form of government paying CRA staff to pursue hundreds of thousands of people like this who just do not have the money to repay is needless, it's damaging, and it is not a compassionate approach. Families are still having their Canada Child benefits clawed back as a result of receiving pandemic benefits. Over 3 years, this government will claw back $1.45 billion in child benefits. Our petition on this issue was presented in the House this morning. In it and in our submission to committee, we outline recommendations for a CERB repayment amnesty. That is to stop pursuing low-income people to repay pandemic benefits. We include recommendations for repayments to families of clawed back CCB amounts in the same way the guaranteed income supplement was repaid to seniors. And we include investing more in the Canada Social Transfer with conditions so that income assistance programs across the country start to advance poverty reduction and human rights commitments. The pandemic has taught us that government transfers can help to end poverty, and it can do that quickly. There's an opportunity to make a decision that will materially change the lives of people by implementing a CERB amnesty, and we do hope that this committee will put the recommendations forward. Thank you for your time. I look forward to answering any questions.
Ms. Sarangi, and now we'll hear from the Council of Canadian Innovators and Mr. Chiavo.
Thank you so much. Good morning to the Chair and members of the Standing Committee on Finance, and thank you for the opportunity to present today on the pre-budget consultations in advance of the 2023 agenda. My name is Nick Schiavo, and I'm the Director of Federal Affairs at the Council of Canadian Innovators. CCI is a national business council representing 150 of Canada's fastest growing technology companies. Our members are headquartered here in Canada, employ north of 52,000 employees across Canada, and are market leaders in the sectors of health, clean, and financial technologies, cybersecurity, AI, and more. Following the release of Budget 2022, CCI celebrated the strong investments in Canadian innovation. But we worry that without proper follow-through, we risk seeing these investments fail to stimulate the economic growth that is so desperately needed right now. I'll be honest, it is a tough time right now to be a Canadian tech company. Our most promising domestic firms, those that should be scaling up and finding new markets, are up against major challenges that pose a real threat to their ability to operate. From an impenetrable procurement system to rising inflation to a talent crisis to uncertainty in global supply chains and federal innovation programs that don't meet the realities of the day, technology firms across Canada are fighting to be successful in 2023. In my remarks today, I want to offer the committee and your colleagues across Parliament concrete recommendations to help Canadian scale-ups grow. In particular, I would draw your attention to the need to develop a procurement strategy for SMEs, update and enhance the SHRED tax credit, address our high-skilled talent shortage, create new frameworks for IP, study the impacts of negative FDI, and bolster our cybersecurity industry. I'll expand briefly on each of these. In 2023, federal procurement just isn't working. Facing an overly complicated system, too many Canadian companies opt to sell their products and services to other countries, resulting in less economic activity for Canadians. For Canada to better leverage the capacities within the country, we need a federal procurement strategy that shelters decision makers from downside risk, allowing them to pursue innovative technologies with enormous upside potential. For years, the Scientific Research and Economic Development Tax Credit, or SHRED, has been a hallmark of Canada's approach to spurring innovation. And CCI was pleased that in the last budget, the government committed to a comprehensive review of SHRED to ensure that it's fit for purpose. Now we need to see that review process begin and consultations with Canadian SMEs take place. CCI has led the way in shaping the future of this nearly $4 billion program with a comprehensive report that offers clear recommendations to modernize, streamline, and enhance SHRED. We're calling on the government to reform SHRED for Canadian scale-ups and bring more accountability to this program to ensure that funds are going to domestic firms instead of foreign multinationals. On talent, it's now estimated that by the end of 2025, employment in the digital economy will reach 2.26 million, or roughly 11% of all employment in Canada. This growth will only trigger demand for additional skilled professionals, and the needs of Canadian companies to attract, generate, and retain top talent have never been greater. Building on CCI's dedicated talent and skill strategy, we're calling on the government to implement a high potential tech visa to increase labor density of skilled talent and accelerate funding for Canadian businesses that develop upskilling and training programs to enhance their domestic workforce. Last year, the government announced the creation of a Canada Innovation and Investment Agency designed to target Canada's core innovation challenges. While we're pleased to see movement towards tackling Canada's low productivity and R&D, public innovation programming must prioritize freedom to operate strategies that complement a company's intellectual property and data activities. The government should implement its announced innovation policies and institutions, like the agency, with an outcomes-based lens that encourages greater business expenditures in research and development, also known as BIRD. When it comes to foreign direct investment in 2023, the prevailing sentiment within many funding agencies is that luring foreign multinational firms will deliver new jobs. Unfortunately, these programs and economic plans can have major negative consequences for the labor market and IP ownership of Canadian firms. In today's intangible economy, when a large multinational opens a satellite office to hire in-demand tech talent, it has a negative impact on local technology companies. These negative economic repercussions must be accounted for at the outset of policy development and strategic decision-making. As such, we recommend that the government study the negative spillovers of FDI in the technology sector, such as the impact multinationals have on wage inflation and the effects this can have on smaller scaling companies that are hungry for talent. Understanding these impacts will empower the government to adapt their net benefit review process for foreign investment so that it is better aligned with the needs of the intangible economy. Finally, domestic capability in cybersecurity is a precondition for our country remaining safe and sovereign in the age of digital threats. If we are not suppliers of cybersecurity solutions, Canada is wholly reliant on external actors, vendors, and countries which have no public accountability to Canadian citizens to design the systems that protect us. In the next National Cybersecurity Action Plan, we urge the government to focus on building domestic partners, developing cyber testing streams for co-developed cyber solutions alongside industry, and addressing the shortage of cyber talent. To conclude, CCI is pleased to see the government investing in Canada's innovation ecosystem. To ensure these investments have the maximum impact on our shared prosperity, we need to implement these policies in the most effective and strategic way possible to create prosperity for all Canadians. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Schiavo. And now to the Fisheries Council of Canada, Mr. Landsbergen, for your opening remarks.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you for the invitation to appear today. It's a pleasure to be here in person, and if I may be so bold, perhaps you saved the best for the last session of your consultations. The last time FCC appeared before this committee was in 2018, and I believe it was our inaugural appearance before FINA. The Fisheries Council of Canada is the national association representing the wild capture processors across the country, all of whom harvest as well. My remarks today will focus on three topics: fishery science, seafood innovation, and Indigenous reconciliation. And I'll briefly highlight why those matter to us. Canada has a good reputation for how it manages its fish resources. In addition to our robust regulatory regime, 60% of Canada's fisheries are third-party certified to ensure that the product is sustainably sourced. This puts us second in the world among large nations for our share of landings that are certified. Unfortunately, this is being undermined by a lack of resources to conduct foundational fisheries science that underpins sustainable fisheries management. DFO resources for core fish stock assessment science have not kept pace with competing interests or assessment complexities. In the East, fish surveys are not being maintained, and data gaps of multiple years exist and could result in overly precautionary decisions despite the stocks being in good health. In the case of turbot in the Eastern Arctic, it could potentially cost the industry tens of millions of dollars of annual revenue. In the West, stock assessments modeling the health of the stocks have been lacking. In the case of our wild Pacific salmon fisheries, this has resulted in us losing our independent eco-certification. This also means losing major investments into a sustainable program. Global markets look for the Marine Stewardship Council certification, and losing this certification can have devastating effects on the hard work to build the market and labeling required to continue in the program, and it puts Canadian fish and seafood at a market disadvantage, with consumers seeking confidence that it is sustainably sourced. The cost of conducting fishery science is much less than the economic consequence of not doing so. You could say investing in fishery science has an economic multiplier effect, which benefits coastal communities. On this topic, we made a number of recommendations, but the most important action you can take as a committee is to recommend an increase in funding resources for fishery science in support of management decision-making. We don't have a specific dollar recommendation, but the Fisheries Committee is soon to release a report which may provide more clarity on what is needed. Moving to the next topic, the federal government continues to consider its next steps in the Blue Economy strategy. To support Canada's seafood sector to achieve the very best sustainable growth and production, further integrated support for innovation and technology deployment is increasingly important. The sector, both wild capture and aquaculture, have a joint vision, which is for the sector by 2040 to be one of the top 3 global best quality and most sustainable seafood producers. Investment in ocean proteins is a smart investment. The high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy has concluded that such investments carry a 10-to-1 benefit ratio and connect with all priorities of this government: environmental, health, social, and economic. Canada would do well to further support this foundational sector for rural, coastal, and Indigenous communities across Canada. The growth envisioned for the wild capture fisheries is by increasing value rather than volume. Market-driven innovation of operations and optimizing utilization is a path to this growth. Existing innovation funding programs are due to expire in 2023 and 24. We ask that these investments be renewed. Lastly, on Indigenous reconciliation, the government wants to see increased Indigenous participation in the sector. To achieve this, it has a policy of willing buyer, willing seller, which confirms compensation to the incumbent license holder for lost access. However, we have received conflicting reports on whether DFO has funds to actually do this. Indigenous reconciliation is a national priority and one that all Canadians should contribute towards, not just individual license holders. No one, not even my Indigenous members, believe involuntary relinquishment of access is the approach to follow. Industry is advancing reconciliation on its own, and where DFO wants more, it must compensate license holders to respect past investments made and not hinder future investments. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Landsbergen. And now just to your right from the Hotel Association of Canada, we have Ms. Grinnell for opening remarks.
Hi, good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Merci pour l'invitation d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. My name is Susie Grinnell, and I am the President and CEO of the Hotel Association of Canada. The tourism and hospitality industry shut down for 2 years during COVID. We did our part to keep Canadians safe, and we are extremely grateful for the government support that kept us alive. It is the reason we have an industry today. Thank you. But those 2 lost years scarred the tourism and hospitality sector. 1 million employees left our sector in the first 2 months of COVID, and today we are still short 200,000 workers. According to a member survey that was in the field yesterday, 50% of our members are limiting available rooms today in our off-season due to labor shortages. Think about that. Half the hotels in this country are operating under capacity because we don't have enough people. As we approach our summer high season, our worker shortfall is projected to grow to 360,000 workers. That is 2 to 3 times higher than any other sector, a problem that will not solve itself without government intervention. As a result of COVID, we also lost 2 years of planned development and growth. We have lost major international events, we have lost new hotel capacity and new attractions. Canada fell from 5th in the world in our global competitiveness ranking to 13th. We are falling behind other countries who pivoted more quickly to meet the now surging global demand for travel. That hurts not just the tourism sector, but the Canadian economy as a whole. We are Canada's largest service export. We employ 1 in 10 Canadians. We operate in every region and riding in Canada. There's not a single part of Canada that does not see tourism as a source of economic strength and civic pride. Top of mind interest in travel to Canada is greater than ever. Google searches are up 100% for travel to Canada, and U.S. bookings are outpacing 2019 levels by 111%. But Canada needs a strategy to turn top-of-mind interest into action. We need to eliminate the barriers created by the lost years of COVID, and we need to rebuild a devastated sector and position it for growth. The industry is waiting the much-anticipated tourism growth strategy that was announced in Budget 2022. The government has a choice to make. Will the tourism growth strategy be a significant investment in tourism attractions, infrastructure, and people, or will we have to watch as Canada continues to fall behind? The tourism growth strategy to work must include the following. We need to rebuild our workforce. We are doing everything we can domestically to recruit Canadians, but more is needed. First thing we can do, the lowest hanging fruit, is we have newcomers arriving into Canada daily, and many of them from Ukraine. We have previously partnered with the government on a bridge program to mobilize new Canadians into available hotel jobs. We are recommending a relaunch of this program called Destination Employment to help with our immediate staffing needs. Next, tourism peaks every year in the summer, and we need to be able to access a seasonal workforce. We are asking for a dedicated stream of seasonal workers similar to the agriculture sector. But our needs are not just seasonal, and they are not short-term. We have permanent positions for all skill levels available year-round. And so, we are also recommending that we find a pathway for short-term workers who want to stay and build a life in Canada. We also need to better align our longer-term immigration criteria with in-demand positions. On investment, the government has an opportunity to co-invest in new attractions, tourism attractions and experiences so that we can capitalize on the top-of-mind international interest in Canada. We need to keep marketing our Canadian brand to the world. We need to build back our business events segment, and we need to ensure that we have enough hotel capacity to support this growth. Committee members, please don't let 2 lost years turn into a lost decade for tourism and hospitality. Our industry showcases the best of Canada to the world. We are an inclusive, safe, and beautiful country, a model for other nations. We are unique in welcoming newcomers across partisan lines. Tourism is the opportunity to share everything beautiful about Mississauga, Calgary, Joliette, Burnaby, and Winnipeg with the world. We can build attractions Canadians can enjoy and share with visitors from around the globe. With the right strategy, we can seize this incredible opportunity to celebrate Canada in all 338 ridings. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Grinnell. I'll have to throw out Mississauga also to that, to that mix, and so we're off to now to hear from the Keystone Agriculture producers. We do have Jill Verwey and Colin Hornby with us. I understand. Is it Mr. Hornby? You're going to be providing opening remarks? No,
it'll be Ms. Verwey.
Ms. Verwey will be providing opening remarks. Ms. Verwey, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and honorable committee members. Thank you for having me here today to present on behalf of Manitoba farmers for the 2023 federal pre-budget consultations. My name's Jill Verwey, and I'm president of the Keystone Agricultural Producers. I operate a multi-generational mixed farm with my husband and children near Portage la Prairie, including approximately 8,000 acres of grain production, beef herd, and also a dairy operation. I'm joined today by our Manager of Communications and Stakeholder Relations, Colin Horby. Keystone Agriculture Producers is Manitoba's general farm policy organization, providing a unified voice on issues that affect agriculture. We're also members of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, the lead national advocating organization for our sector, who presented to your committee in October of 2022. Today, I'll briefly discuss our top 3 recommendations for the 2023 federal budget. These 3 recommendations have been reiterated by other farming organizations, including CFA, indicating their importance to farmers across Canada. These recommendations highlight the need for the federal government to address gaps in agriculture and the agricultural food chain. Our first recommendation is to increase the technical support and funding for implementing 4R nutrient stewardship to ensure more farmers can participate in reducing their emissions from fertilizer use. The 4R nutrient stewardship is a framework that optimizes efficient fertilizer use through best management practices and is sometimes we promote to our members. This recommendation relates to the government's voluntary target of a 30% reduction in nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer below 2022 levels by 2030. Progress has been made by Manitoba with farmers employing sustainable farm practices to reduce these emissions, such as using enhanced efficiency fertilizers, inhibitors, cover cropping, precision agriculture, nutrient management planning, and transitioning from fall to spring applied fertilizer. However, if the federal government is looking to farmers to further reduce their emissions to help meet national environmental goals, there must be additional resources to enhance the adoption of advanced practices and technologies. These emissions targets must be supported by ample federal funding and technical support for farmers. Our second recommendation is to exempt propane and natural gas used to heat and cool livestock buildings and to dry grain from the carbon tax. CAP has been advocating to the federal government for an exemption from carbon pricing on this issue since it took effect in 2018. If the intent of carbon pricing is to change behavior by discouraging the consumption of carbon-based products, its application on farmers is misguided in its areas when it's applied to unavoidable components of our operations. Firstly, producers are price takers when selling their livestock and grain. They have little influence on the prevailing market price of commodities. Secondly, in Manitoba, farmers operate livestock buildings in extreme temperature ranges, and the inside temperature must be maintained at a safe level to ensure the best management practices of animal welfare. And thirdly, grain drying keeps the moisture levels down, preventing food safety issues such as development of mycotoxins, and protects Canada's brand. These exemptions are included in Bill C-234 for natural gas and propane. We would welcome the inclusion of this legislation change in the budget 2023. Our third recommendation is for the increase and expansion of the Agricultural Clean Technology Fund's adoption stream, including funding for smaller projects and increasing government cost sharing for smaller operations. This stream was doubled in the budget of 2022. While our sector is appreciative of this, the funding should be supplemented in this year's budget to include smaller budget projects and farms that were not eligible under the current requirements. These are farms who cannot generally afford the adoption of the latest technologies and accessibility barriers that have created due to the current program structure and funding limitations. Increased funding would capture many of these farms while enabling them to incorporate practices and technologies to reduce GHG emissions. In conclusion, as we move into the future, we must recognize that agriculture has the answer to many challenges we face, but government and policymakers must be committed to working collaboratively with our industry. Farmers and others in our sector need the opportunity to provide input and be involved in the decision-making process as we tackle these challenges that we face. Our organization, along with other farm groups, are here to work with government and industry on advancing our common interests. Thank you again for your time, and we are happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Verwey, and thank you to all our witnesses for your opening remarks. I know that after winter break, members are pretty eager and energized to ask many questions of the witnesses. We are going to get into our first round now of questions. In this round, just for the witnesses' sake, and you understand, there's 6 minutes for each party to ask questions. We are starting with the Conservatives. I have MP Morantz for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I particularly appreciate the shout-out for Winnipeg, my hometown. Thank you very much, Ms. Grinnell. I'm going to start, though, with my questions with Mr. Mueller from the aerospace industry. You know, it just feels like after 8 years of Justin Trudeau, everything is just broken in this country. You know, we have high made-in-Canada inflation. We have high made in Canada interest rates. We have a carbon tax, which is unfair and inequitable and does nothing to reduce carbon in our atmosphere. We have the luxury tax, which you pointed out, and other taxes as well. But it's the luxury tax as it pertains to your industry that I wanted to focus on with you today. And I want to go back to your brief because, to put it in context, your brief says that the aerospace sector is a major engine of the Canadian economy. In 2021, the industry contributed more than $24 billion in GDP and 200,000 jobs. And it's a massive footprint, much of which is in my home riding in Winnipeg. We've got a major aerospace footprint with companies like Magellan and Standard Aero, Boeing, and the airport is in my riding, and a number of others. And so this really hits home for residents in Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Heading, I can tell you. So you say the numbers are significant, even though they are greatly reduced from pre-pandemic figures. Overall, between 2019 and 2021, the aerospace industry's contribution to the Canadian economy declined by $9.4 billion and 35,000 jobs. And so you would think that a government of the day would want to try and help with that situation. But what is the brilliant solution of Mr. Trudeau's Liberal government to this devastation within the aerospace industry? Their solution is to bring in a punishing so-called luxury tax. So let's talk about that tax, because it's filled with virtue signaling about making sure that wealthy people pay their share, of course. But what is the actual effect? It doesn't really help. It doesn't really help raise a lot of revenue. In fact, it may be negative, as you pointed out, in terms of the cost to the federal treasury. What it really does, it hurts everyday common workers in every industry it affects. So, for example, you point out in your brief that, well, it's designed for taxing Canadians' wealthiest citizens. The luxury tax is harming one of Canada's most important industrial sectors. It's penalizing aircraft operators. The industry estimates that the legislation will cost $1 billion in lost revenue. You yourself said a few moments ago that you were aware of contracts that have been canceled, actual contracts, which means jobs have been canceled in this country because of a tax that has no valid policy reason behind it, that is filled with virtue signaling and does nothing to help the Canadian economy or jobs. So I've said a lot in my little preamble, but I'm going to let you run with that because I want you to talk a little bit more about the job losses and the supply chain issues and those kinds of things around the tax.
Oh, thank you for the question, and I think you raised an interesting point there, that the aerospace industry is right across the country. It's in, maybe not as many ridings as hotels, but right across the country, in every single region of the country, you have an aerospace sector. And you're right to point out that through the pandemic, we lost 35,000 jobs. Our GDP contribution went down $9.4 billion. We were appreciative of the government for some funding support in Budget 2021. Which was great, but we have a lot of very serious concerns with the luxury tax that is being placed on the industry. It came into effect on September 1st, and 10% tax on the manufacturers of those aircraft. And you're right to point out the 35,000 jobs. These are high-skilled, highly paid jobs in every region of the country. And one of the points that I think is sometimes lost that I really want to make clear is that this is not just on the manufacturers. This is on the supply chain, which goes right across the country. And we're seeing impacts in British Columbia, in Winnipeg, Montreal, obviously, where a lot of the planes are manufactured, but huge ripple-out effects right across the country. Big concerns. We were very concerned also that the government did not do their own economic analysis in bringing in this tax. And that's why we went out to HAC Montreal to do an independent study. And that independent study showed 2,000 jobs being lost, 750 jobs on the manufacturing side, and then the rest across the supply chain right across the country. The report also showed a reduction in $29.9 million in income tax being paid by those workers that are no longer going to be there, while the Parliamentary Budget Office is predicting a $9 million return in taxes. So the numbers just don't make sense. I think the bottom line is if you're building less planes, which we will be because of the tax, you're employing less people to build those planes. Bottom line. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that answer. And how much time? 30 seconds. About 30 seconds? Okay. Mr. Mueller, the Liberal government is here. What would you like to say to them about removing the luxury tax?
Well, I think I would say to the government, we thank them for the investments they made in Budget 2021, which was very much needed coming out of the pandemic. But this luxury tax aircraft needs to be removed from the luxury tax because it's hurting the industry, it's hurting workers, and the impacts are going to be felt right across the country.
Now we're going to the Liberals, and I've got MP Baker for 6 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you all for being here. I wish I had time to ask all of you questions. I'll try to spread them around a little bit and ask for your assistance in keeping your responses as concise as possible, just so I can get to everybody who would like to ask a question, too, if I may. So, Mike, it's great to see you here again today. As you know, I had the privilege of working with you and your colleagues as the Liberal member on the Aerospace Caucus in the prior Parliament, and really, really proud of that work. One of the things I wanted to do was ask you about the work that we're doing, that your members are doing, that the industry is doing in supporting the brave people of Ukraine. And of course, the government of Canada has provided significant military aid to Ukraine. I wonder if you could just talk, very briefly about what the impact's been on your sector of those investments that we're making.
Thank you, MP Baker, for your interest and always support for our industry. It's been greatly appreciated, and especially your leadership on the Ukrainian file. We had a lot of companies spring into action right after the illegal invasion of Ukraine, wanting to know how can we leverage the aerospace industry to help out the people of the Ukraine. And we have companies that sprung into action, helping to airlift material, a whole host of different items. And really thank you for your leadership in helping us facilitate some of those pieces. On the defense procurement side, again, wherever we can help, we are there to help. As I mentioned in my opening remarks on NORAD modernization and the defense policy review, there's a lot of very significant funding coming down the pipe, and industry needs to be a part of that. Collaboration has to be there with industry to help fulfill the needs that are out there in an increasingly dangerous world.
That. My thanks to your members for stepping up, and I know that they will continue to do so as we need to do more to not only support the Ukrainian people but also to reinforce our own security. So thank you for that. And could you just briefly, you mentioned the investments in budget 2021. Could you just briefly mention for those who aren't familiar what that was?
Yeah, we were advocating. Obviously, the aerospace sector was hit harder than most through the pandemic with the restrictions in place, and so Budget 2021 had submitted $1.75 billion through the SIF program dedicated to aerospace, which we were grateful for, and then the Aerospace Regional Recovery Initiative, $250 million for small, medium-sized businesses. As part of our recommendations to the committee, we are making some recommendations for those two programs in order for companies to access the programs in an easier manner and then have more companies access them in a timely manner. We're seeing a slow uptake and a slow process to get some of the announcements. It was announced in Budget 2021, and we're now just starting to see announcements. And so we're recommending that the program specific to ARRI be extended even further to enable those small, medium-sized businesses to take advantage of the program that is there. But I think it's important to note that also that in the context of all of this, what is very much required is the need for an aerospace strategy. And we have funding on the innovation side. We're recapitalizing the Air Force as we're moving forward, but we don't have that overarching strategy that our competitor nations do, and that is what is very much required. We were encouraged by Minister Freeland's comment on industrial strategies, and we are looking forward to those kinds of discussions because it's absolutely critical for our industry in particular.
I really appreciate that constructive input, Mike. Thank you. If I may, I'm going to switch gears. I think I have about 2 minutes left. Ms. Greinel, if I could, I'd like to come to you. And I also, like the other members, try not to take it personally that you didn't mention Etobicoke in your list of locations where we could build hotels. But I'm nevertheless interested in your sector and the contributions it makes to my constituents and to people across Canada. So I'll ask you a question about that. I wrote down, I noted as you were speaking during your introductory remarks, and forgive me if I misquoted you, but this is what I wrote down, that the supports that were provided during COVID are the reasons that we have an industry today. Did I accurately portray what you said earlier?
Yes, that is accurate.
Okay. I appreciate that. And one of the things that we've heard from some members, unfortunately, in the House, I have to be frank about this, is that we hear some members say that the supports that were provided during COVID was wasteful spending. We hear that. I think you've probably heard that. Do you agree with that characterization?
Certainly not for the hardest hit sectors. We have been on life support for the last 2 years. We had absolutely no way of operating over that time period, and if the government had not chosen to invest in our employees so that we could maintain those relationships and the fixed cost support, we would have lost all of the assets across this country. At the time of the COVID period, we were forecasting month after month that more than 60% of the industry would have shuttered permanently.
I appreciate that. I know I only have a little bit of time left, so I thank you for that. I guess what I would say, my takeaway from this is, after 7 and some odd years of this government, that a lot of the problems that were there when we took office are actually being fixed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, MP Baker. And now we're off to hear from the bloc and our colleague, MP Samari.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to say hello to all the witnesses. Thank you for coming here. It's great to see witnesses in person, and also to see those who are online. And this is our last day of consultations. We've heard your recommendations. Your work is most appreciated. I have limited time. I can't ask everyone a question, but your reports, briefs, and presentations will be used and will figure in our recommendations, including those who have not had an opportunity to come here and appear before the committee. We have received a tremendous amount of reports, and I'm hoping that they will all be taken into consideration. I have a question for Mr. Mueller from the Aerospace Industries Association. Thank you for your recommendations. I'd like to begin my question by talking about this luxury tax. Here in the committee, we're very concerned about the form of the luxury tax. I'm not against the principle of taxing the wealthiest in society in an effort to better distribute wealth, but the way that this tax is being applied and the consequences are another matter. My colleague, Mr. Chambers, moved a motion that we adopted that asks the minister to do an impact study, because this tax was adopted without any impact study done, and we're looking forward to seeing the final report and hearing from the officials. And the minister will be called before the committee to see what can be done. Given that the impact study has not yet been done, I understand that a study has been done elsewhere. Mr. Mueller, we heard in the past few months that the government supports the aerospace sector well, which means that they're not being affected. What do you think of that? Thank you very much for your question.
And very good comments. And I'd like to thank you, Mr. St. Marie, for your support for our industry. In addition to your colleague, MP Savard Tremblay, who's on our Parliamentary Aerospace Caucus. And while I'm thanking people, Mr. Chambers, thank you too for moving that motion, because we were very concerned with respect to not having a clear economic impact from the government on this tax, which is what led us to go and get an independent study done from HAC Montreal from Professor Waugh. And the results were even worse than what we had predicted. We'd gone out to industry and did some consultations just trying to get a sense of the impact. I think I was before the committee, before that report, predicting the potential of over 1,000 jobs, but the report came back and is showing over 2,000 jobs to be lost because of the tax. And I don't understand the rationale behind this kind of a tax, because it's a tax on manufacturers. It's a tax on those producing the goods versus a tax on those that are using the goods, which is what you had pointed out. And as I said before, we were very grateful for the government for putting money in budget 2021, which is needed and is being accessed by industry. But then on the flip side, it's counterproductive to put a 10% tax on aerospace products. And as I said before, lots of times folks think of the aerospace sector being predominantly in Montreal, but it's right across the country. And we see the impacts of the tax that's going to be spread right across the country. We have companies in British Columbia, companies in PEI, companies in Winnipeg, right across the board here. So we're very concerned about the impact of the tax. We're very concerned that the government did not do an economic analysis before bringing into place the tax. So we're eagerly awaiting that some of your deliberations on that matter.
Merci. Toujours sur le même.
Thank you. On the same question, the government said that it did consult the industry and amended the tax to deal with concerns expressed by the aerospace sector. Can you confirm this? Do you feel that this was adequate for your industry? Thank you.
There was some consultation. We did consult on it, but we don't think it was obviously enough consultation because of the lack of economic impact by the government, not knowing exactly what would be coming into place. They did take our recommendation on amending a certain piece of the legislation with respect to how money is taken from industry when it is when the product or the aircraft is being exported. So there's some pretty significant cash flow considerations if that wouldn't have been changed. So we are appreciative of the government for making that change, but there's still significant recommendations that we are making with respect to charter services. I know some companies are having issues with that, and then the threshold for how you define personal use versus business use is unrealistic in our view.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Now we're going to the NDP and welcome MP Green to our committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the committee members for welcoming me here today, and thank you to the witnesses. I am sitting in for my colleague, my dear friend Daniel Blakey, who cannot be here, but sends his regards and certainly has a keen interest and will be following up accordingly. The questions that I have prepared today are in response to Ms. Sarangi and Campaign 2000. Ms. Sarangi, welcome back to the Finance Committee, and thank you for taking the time to meet with us today. In the 2022 pre-budget consultations, Campaign 2000 testified that almost exactly a year ago now, actually, that you spoke about the need for the CERB repayment amnesty for low-income Canadians. Now in 2023, there is still no plan in place for this low-income repayment amnesty, and you had referenced some of this in your opening remarks, but perhaps you could share with us what's changed since last year for low-income Canadians who are struggling with CERB debt.
Through the chair, thank you so much for your question, Mr. Green, and for inviting me back to speak. I think, so we have actually been tracking the impact of the CERB since early days of pandemic around April 2020, when it had interactions right away with people who are on social and income assistance in most provinces and territories. The lowest income people in our communities were experiencing clawbacks because they received the CERB, and they received the CERB at that time because they were being told to by their caseworkers, by CRA, and by government discourse that was saying, apply for these benefits, we are leaving nobody behind. And threshold eligibility requirements were changing constantly, especially in those early days. So we've been actually asking for a CERB repayment amnesty for now. This is coming into the third year for the need for this. And over time, I think what we all know that's happened, especially over the past year, is this unprecedented rise in inflation, where food inflation is outpacing overall inflation. People do not have the money to deal with a CERB debt, and they are really struggling to meet their basic needs. These are, our basic human rights. We have government obligations and commitments, multiple commitments that we've made. And for people, especially over this last year, things are so dire. And it is really, when you're in community, speaking with constituents, you can see that there is nowhere for people to turn to. I think we've all seen these pictures of people lined up outside of food banks. That's, social assistance and disability assistance programs is where people are turning to, but those are leaving them in destitution. People are having a really, really hard time, and putting a debt that goes up to $14,000 onto these folks, asking them to enter into repayment plans of $5, $10, $15 a month, which would be a debt that they would carry for 40 years, is, it goes against all of our obligations and commitments and puts a lot of pressure on these folks.
Thank you. Certainly those stories are very difficult to hear. I want to reference for a moment the Just Recovery Hamilton report that just happened, a 2023 report that was released in my city just this week by a coalition of 20 social service agencies who referenced the good that CERB did. And you may or may not know, but in Hamilton we had a pilot for basically basic income and the way in which it lifted people out of poverty. In Hamilton, for instance, the CERB and CRB program impacted 20% of Hamilton residents, allowing them to buy essential goods for their family. And yet, we have this scenario where the CRA seems intent on pursuing them, but yet when I reference headlines that they say it wouldn't be worth the effort to review all the ineligible pandemic payments when it relates to wage subsidies, billions of dollars that went to big corporations that then laid people off and in many cases paid out significant shareholder bonuses, including to ridiculously wealthy CEOs. The report examined CRB and the Qs, and it estimated that $27.4 billion should be investigated further, and that of that, $15.5 billion was paid out to the wage subsidy, meaning that it went to employers directly. So can you just talk a little bit about, from your perspective, the opportunity cost of having the CRA doggedly pursue, spending our money, good money after bad, to pursue the lowest income people who are just struggling to get by in record high inflation, while simultaneously allowing the wealthiest corporations in this country to walk without any type of liability?
Thank you for pointing that important point out. I believe that the federal government has earmarked over $250 million to pursue these individuals on low income who just do not have even $5, $10 a month out of their budget. Means they're making choices around what food they're not going to buy for their kids or what medication they're going to skip that month. And we were really concerned with reports that are coming out saying that the wage subsidy is not going to be looked at in the same kinds of ways, that the focus is going to be on pursuing these low-income individuals and families who really need government support right now, and letting big corporations and their wage subsidies off the hook. And we know that the government didn't ask for, the Attorney General report that came out just last month says that they didn't even collect enough data to find out if the wage subsidy did what it was supposed to do, and that was keeping employees on the payroll. That is what the government should be investigating, and that is where the government should be putting attention towards recouping amounts and revenues not from individuals and not from families who are struggling.
Thank you.
MP Green and members, witnesses, we're moving into our second round. In this round, time is a little different for each of the parties. We're opening up with the Conservatives for 5 minutes. MP Lawrence for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I think, as you said, Mr. Landsberger, maybe we did save some of the best for last here. Some great testimony today. Just three of the critical elements for economic growth, really in any industry, are innovation, labor, and capital. And it's my assertion, and I think we'll establish some proof points, is that this Liberal government has been undermining all three of those elements. So I'll start with you, Ms. Grinnell. As we look forward, and your industry has obviously been hit very hard in 2020 and 21 through the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about the labor challenges your industry is experiencing, and how is the government helping you by having a $2.1 million backlog in the immigration system? Are we getting the newcomers that we need to help you with your industry?
The labor challenge in our sector is acute, as I've indicated. It is the single biggest barrier to our growth. The biggest challenge with the immigration system, whether people are coming in short term or they're coming in permanently, is that the in-demand workers that we need in our sector are not allowed in through that system. And so there fundamentally needs to be reform over the long term if we're going to solve this challenge. But we have also put recommendations forward around what we can do in the short term and in the immediate term. And in the immediate term, we are recommending a program that would support newcomers to Canada. It's one we've run successfully with the government in the past. It's called destination employment. That would be the sort of lowest hanging fruit, targeting in particular Ukrainians that are here, and many of whom are unemployed and could easily come into our sector, and we could accommodate any skill level, any language ability, and we have all kinds of training opportunities for those individuals. So that's the immediate opportunity. And we're also looking for reforms to the temporary foreign worker program where we could have a dedicated stream. It really comes down to prioritization and processing. And I will say that at this point in time, our industry is not a priority.
Thank you very much. It's very telling. I guess the other issue, and I'll move on to the Canadian Council of Innovators, but the other issue is, of course, the marginal effective tax rate for low-income parents is around 75 to 80%. And a lot of, as I understand it, a lot of your industry is women, and a lot of them, of course, have children as well. And so they're only going to keep 25 cents or 20 cents on their next dollar earned. So a real challenge to you. And like I said, I think the government has systemically, over the last 8 years, undermined the labor market. I'll move over to the Canadian Council of Innovators. When it gets to innovation in Canada, I don't think according to the OECD and other multinational measures, Canada is lagging behind. And I believe it's Nicholas. Am I incorrect in that, or is that a fair commentary?
Correct. So our economic output per capita has been the worst amongst advanced nations in the OECD since the 1970s. And this is a trend that we expect to continue until 2060.
Okay, so we are seeing that innovation is a real struggle for our country going forward. We're seeing the struggle in the labor market. I'm going to go and talk a little bit about capital now and go to you, Mr. Mueller. Just when we talk about taxation and we talk about the luxury tax and we take money directly from a company, does that worsen or improve your members' ability to invest in their businesses to make them more competitive on the global market?
Well, yes, I think there would be, but there's also that international reputational piece that is there. When I speak to my international counterparts, and they ask, how's it going in Canada? And when I talk about the luxury tax in particular, they look at me with disbelief, and they say, we want the industry that you guys have. I can't believe the government is putting a tax on your industry when we want what you have. So it's almost good for them, but they can't believe the government would be doing that. But I think it's important to point out also less aircraft being built equals less jobs. And it's also very rare when industry and unions come together on the same side of the table and says, don't do this because it's bad for jobs. These are high skill, high-paid jobs that it's going to have an impact on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mueller. My time is limited. We've heard from 3 separate industries and strong proof points that innovation, capital, and labor have all been undermined over the last 8 years. Canada is indeed broken, and these Liberals have broken it.
Thank you, MP Lawrence. And now moving to MP Zarowitz, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and I want to say thanks to all the amazing presenters today. I wish I had time to ask all of you questions. I will begin with the Council of Canadian Innovators and see if I can find my way back to the table here. We are, as a federal government, recognizing that we need to do more around innovation and setting and investing more to set Canada up for continued success moving forward. I know in our last budget we announced the creation of a Canadian Innovation and Investment Agency, as well as the review of SHRED, among many other things. Mr. Schiavo, I do want to maybe delve down a little bit more to your recommendations to make sure I'm very clear, because I think they're very important. You were quite clear about the federal procurement strategy and the need for it to be less complicated and much easier for Canadian innovators to enter it. So thank you for that. In terms of SHRED, heard you loud and clear. We need to begin the consultation on that review, as well as I appreciate that you have a full report out, which I know I will be reading, and I think that we're anxious to get going on that as well. My first question is really around your third point around talent. There actually is a global talent stream, and it was very deliberately set up for technology talent, or some of the most sort of sought after sort of high skilled workers around the world, and it's supposed to be able to bring in workers within a 2-week time period. So can you maybe talk to what is that program not working for you, and what specifically would you be looking to adjust in that program so it could better ensure that we are attracting some of the best talent around the world?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And let me begin by saying, I think the Global Talent Stream was an initiative by this government that has helped our industry tremendously. CCI is actually a designated referral partner in that program, and so it's something we interact with all the time. In terms of ameliorating that program, I would say increasing the thresholds in terms of the amount of skilled talent that we can bring into Canada would be very helpful. But, to speak to some of our recommendations, we're also looking at other strategies where we can have skilled talent come to Canada without a job offer. So this is known as a high potential tech visa. This is something that other countries have implemented quite well. And the idea is to really bolster the labor density in these communities. The more you bring this high tech talent into these communities and create that connective tissue, the more likely they are to embed themselves in our SMEs. I would also say we'd love to see federal leadership in terms of convening, research institutions, provinces, territories, bringing people together to have a national summit around high-tech talent.
Thank you. That's very helpful. The next thing I want to talk about is you talked about IP strategy, very important, as well as you talked about patent collectives. We did invest $30 million in a patent collective pilot that's been focused on clean tech. I want to know whether you think that's been successful, whether you think that needs to be renewed, and how do you think we should expand that?
Absolutely. So the Innovation Asset Collective, I think, has been a huge success. This is an organization that we work quite closely with. And actually, in the most recent months, we submitted a letter of support for the renewal of that program, but also for the expansion. So really, I think our ask to government is to see that program renewed, yes, but with more funding and a greater focus on other sectors as well, health tech, fintech, cybersecurity, just because the model works quite well. So yes, we'd love to see that continue and grow.
My next question is about there's a huge shift in our economy. So we're moving more from tangible assets, as they say, to intangible assets, which is why we talk a lot about IP protection, why we talk about data, why we talk about freedom to operate. What would be some of our your next steps recommendation to make sure that we are putting some of those rules into place so that Canadian businesses know what those rules are so they'd be able to succeed?
Yeah, two very tangible examples. One, as you mentioned, comes from Budget 2022. That is a patent box regime. Again, this is something that many other countries do very well. And the idea is you are taxing, commercialized technologies that are developed here in Canada at a lower corporate tax rate to really encourage those patents. This is something that we should get up and running as soon as possible. Another idea is, which Israel does quite effectively, a payback clause in terms of IP. So when a company decides to offshore or sell technology that has been publicly invested in by Canadian taxpayers, there is an obligation to repay that investment back to taxpayers, typically at a multiple of 2 or 3 times, just as a private sector investor would expect. And so the idea, again, is to really stimulate opportunities to protect that intellectual property and create that wealth over time.
How much do I have time? Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then it goes quickly. To the block, and MP Sainte-Marie, please.
Oui, merci, monsieur.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mueller, you talked about the union's position with respect to the concerns on the luxury text. I'd like to quote from a statement made by Dave Chartrand, who represents a union. He said, "We agree that we should make the wealthy pay their part, but that's not what this tax does. In its current form, this tax is hurting aerospace workers and our economy. The government should review how this tax is operating." Mr. Mueller, do you agree with this analysis?
Yes, absolutely. The government should review it and take a look at the impacts of the tax. It is hurting workers, it's hurting manufacturers, and again, as I said before, it's interesting when you have union representatives, industry representatives coming to the same table to the same meetings, saying the same things, saying, please don't do this. It's going to hurt workers. It's going to hurt, high skill, high paid jobs. And then the capability and the capacity of the aerospace sector in Canada too. It's going to hurt. But I think if I could just go back, I think, the overall piece, which is that aerospace strategy, which was my first point in my opening remarks, it's absolutely critical that we have an aerospace strategy. And it's my firm belief that if the government, and I hope all parties would agree with this, the need for an airspace strategy, identify airspace as strategic, put in place a strategy, you wouldn't have these one-offs and you wouldn't have policies working in contradiction to each other, which is what we're seeing now. Money being put into innovation, which we are grateful for, but then the luxury tax hurting manufacturers, hurting jobs, hurting the capacity and the capability that the other funding is looking to build up. So a little bit of a contradiction there.
Merci. Monsieur le Président, il me reste du temps.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do I have any time? 30 seconds. So indeed, it's important that we have a global strategy to support such an important sector. And I'd like to remind committee colleagues that all of the countries with an aerospace sector, they all have a support strategy. And they all work together, all of the countries, with the exception of Canada. And things need to change. Thank you.
And now to the NDP, MP Green.
Thank you very much. I want to go back to the 2023 Just Recovery Hamilton report for Mrs. Sarangi. And I want to highlight something that she talked about in terms of food banks. 75% of people accessing food banks in Hamilton are on social assistance. Poverty among seniors and those with disabilities in Hamilton has increased over the past several years. From 2016 to 2021, our seniors' poverty rate rose from 11 to 12%. And people in Hamilton on provincial social assistance have seen their supports completely stagnated, with people on ODSP having an annual income of $9,600 below the poverty line, below the low-income poverty line. And the folks that are on Ontario Works, for them, in many cases, it's even worse, with their supports being frozen at $733 a month. So this stagnation of social supports, coupled with this astronomical increase in the rise of the costs of food and rent and the basic necessities for survival, I'm wondering if you could just perhaps take the last remaining moments here and share what you're hearing in terms of the human impacts of legislated poverty across the country, based on the stories that you've heard and the work that you've done.
Thank you for that question. There is no social or disability assistance program in any jurisdiction across the country that brings people's incomes to that low income measure. And that low income measure is not a thriving income. It is just getting by in the day to day. The stories that I hear are horrendous. People call my cell phone all the time in desperation, and there is nowhere for people to turn to. We are really encouraging this government to not make things worse by implementing a CERB amnesty immediately and then looking at the Canada social transfer. That's the block transfer that goes to provinces and territories to fund these programs, increase investments in those, and tie them to conditions to make sure they're advancing our human rights obligations.
Just on that note, I'm sure you're familiar that the Liberal government promised to introduce the Canadian Disability Benefit without delay some 870 days ago. I'm wondering if you would see a national disability benefit program help lift people out of poverty as well for consideration in this 2023 budget.
Absolutely. That is an urgent priority. And we would also like to see a disability benefit for children and a caregiver's benefit for their caregivers. Children and families who are caring for children with disabilities are not included in that federal disability benefit. Both of those things are extraordinarily urgent and should be moved on as a number one priority.
Thank you, MP Green. Now to the Conservatives, MP Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Landsberg, you mentioned in your opening remarks about a willing buyer, willing seller model, and I just would like to clarify, are you suggesting that that model isn't actually occurring, or there's circumstances where that's not the case?
Yes, we have two live cases where the willing buyer, willing seller policy of the federal government, as stated by Minister Jordan in March 3rd, 2021, is not being followed. There's the Elver fishery in Atlantic Canada and Dungeness crab on the west coast, where the government is essentially expropriating part of the individual license holders' access to reallocate to Indigenous interests.
Indigenous reconciliation is obviously very important. It includes economic reconciliation, so it makes sense that the government's trying to increase participation in the industry, but at the same time, for a license holder to have a property expropriated with no compensation doesn't really seem to be the principle or the initial intention of the policy, correct?
Yes, and the government doesn't necessarily have to intervene to increase Indigenous participation in the sector. As I said, it is happening through industry collaboration, through non-Indigenous and Indigenous interests, where they will come together to bring more Indigenous participation in the sector, whether it be company-owned, where they buy the assets and the access from Indigenous or non-Indigenous interests. There's also government programs, the Integrated Commercial Fisheries Initiatives for Atlantic Canada, Pacific, and even the Arctic. And that's where the government would give money to Indigenous communities and help them train, and then they would go and negotiate a transfer from the incumbent license holders.
Do you have any idea, is there an amount of money that might help this situation?
It's difficult to say because it depends on how much access the government wants to transfer and which fisheries, because they have different values. I would say it's in the perhaps tens of millions of dollars as opposed to, say, hundreds of millions, and certainly not into the billions. But again, it depends on how much, how quickly, and also how it's done.
Thank you very much. Ms. Grenell, when a hotel room goes empty for a day, you can never recover that potential lost revenue. And you're suggesting 50% of your members have vacancies, not because there's no people wanting to take the room, but because there's no workers to support that business. Is that right?
That's correct. 50% of our members, for a survey that was in the field yesterday, have said that they are limiting hotel room capacity. Of that 50%, 90% are saying that they're limiting up to a quarter, and we're in our off-season today.
Wow. This was just yesterday, I assume. Do you have any estimates on how much this is costing or could cost the Canadian economy? If you don't have it now, that's fine. If you it would be, oh, great, wonderful.
I do. Glad you asked. I do have that. Let's look at just a 100-room average hotel. The cost of not having a labor supply is $725,000 in lost revenue for the year. That's 43% down in profit from a normal year, and rolling that up to an overall industry impact, it would be an annual loss of $3.3 billion in revenue loss. And that will only increase as we get to the summer periods.
So this is potential tax revenue from profit from a small business, employees that would be paying taxes, that have a job. You heard about this global talent stream, which will bring people in 2 weeks. Why are we doing this between industries, picking who should get in faster than others? Why can't everybody come in 2 weeks if they meet the criteria, or if you've used the worker program before? Why can't you be fast-tracked like Nexus?
That's an excellent question. It is part of our recommendation that the government look at all of the systems and ways in which people come into the country and effectively prioritize the most in-demand sectors, and we certainly fit that bill. And so that is one of our primary recommendations, because if we do that and we invest in a labor force, we can capitalize on what is historic demand for Canada today. And if we don't do that, then we'll be letting other countries eat our lunch.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chambers. And now over to the Liberals. MP MacDonald for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank all witnesses here today. I have a couple of pages of questions, but I know I won't get to all of them. But I'm going to start with the Fisheries Council of Canada, Mr. Landsbergen. One of your recommendations surrounding the fishery science was to conduct review of other countries and compare those practices in the area of fishery science. Do you have any specific practices from other countries that you would like to see Canada adopt?
That's a good question. I think as we move forward, there's new technologies that can come to bear to make fish surveys in particular. So instead of having vessels go out and do comparative trawls or trawls, maybe there's new technologies that we can use radar technology or something else that would estimate the abundance of fish stocks. And maybe some countries like Iceland or Norway are ahead of us in that respect. It's difficult to say because some countries don't have the same diversity of species as we do. And so for them to conduct that fishery science, it's perhaps simpler. We also have the longest coastline in the world, so there are some challenges, but it never hurts to look at what others are doing.
Yeah. And just recently, we know that there was a moratorium on redfish, and it's supposedly coming back. The discussions that with the Canadian Independent Fisheries yesterday. But another one of your recommendations was to engage with industry to leverage industry resources to promptly guarantee assessments. Can you expand on what resources you're kind of referring to and relative to the industry itself?
Yes, thank you. In some fisheries, the industry is the primary, purveyor of the fishery science. So for shrimp, for example, the industry has been doing the fish surveys for 20 years and never missed a beat. However, in the Eastern Arctic for turbot, the government has been relying on Greenland for a vessel. And in recent years, there's been challenges securing that vessel, and we don't have our own vessel to use, and so it's resulted in 4 years of data gaps. And so that's obviously troubling. The survey did occur this past fall using using the Greenland vessel. In other fisheries, we've been relying on aging Coast Guard vessels. The new ones have now come on stream. They've had some challenges in commissioning and things like that. So hopefully the worst is behind us, but we're still very concerned that the government needs to have a backup plan in case they have problems, and they need to give us enough notice that we can use one of our vessels. We can configure it the exact same way as a Coast Guard vessel, but if you give us a month's notice, we could probably make it happen. If you give us 3 days, not possible.
And obviously coming out of the pandemic, and there's obvious global economic challenges. And as we hear around this table from time to time, we have to be mindful of our spending. And I think our most recent budget was actually targeted spend, and it was a good budget. But what are some of the regulatory changes the government could make that you believe would be beneficial to the industry without necessarily carrying a price tag? So is there policy, is there regulations that need to change that could have a positive effect on your industry?
That's a great question. As part of the Blue Economy Strategy, the government is conducting a regulatory review now with consultation deadline of March 17th or something like that. So we're working with our members to collect examples of where regulations are representing a barrier to some innovations. And I think one of the examples that I'm looking at mostly is the gear type regulations can be quite prescriptive, where it says we need to use a certain gear equipment in a certain fashion. We're coming up with new innovations that will enable us to be more efficient, have perhaps less bycatch, less other environmental impacts, but the regulations may not provide an opportunity to do that. So that's one of the biggest areas that I think we need to look at first.
And 30 seconds, just very quickly, how can we increase our competitive level nationally and internationally? So our competitiveness among other countries for your sector. Is there any one particular item that stands out that says we could grow this sector with ?
I think the biggest thing is a change in culture within DFO so that it views itself as a champion for the industry and not just a regulator of our resource.
MP McDonald. So members, witnesses, we are moving into our third round, and this we do have enough time for one full more round, and we are starting off with the Conservatives and MP Hallen.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Ms. Gernal, 2021, we know how hard the tourism industry was hit. In speaking with many people from the hotel industry and especially the travel industry, which we know women, single moms were hit the worst. A lot of the complaints back then were that the vaccine mandates for travel were a big issue, where people who were vaccinated were, and even those that were unvaccinated, were going to countries that had looser restrictions at the time. So that was one of the biggest complaints, especially from the single moms that got hit the worst by during the pandemic. 2021, we saw vaccines were available in Canada. We saw countries with lower vaccination rates in Canada lifting their restrictions at the time. We also saw an unnecessary election called by the Prime Minister, where at the time it was okay to be around big gatherings and all of that, and those people from the tourism industry were saying, well, how come it's okay for those big gatherings to happen while they were getting hit with some of the the restrictions were really limiting to how much money they could make because people didn't want to come to Canada because of the restrictions. So given all of that, and just seeing a report that came from the court that said Canada's top health expert did not recommend a vaccine requirement before boarding a bus, train, or plane. So it points to that this was more political science than actual science based on that. How hard was the industry hit? And by this, that's the first question, because we see that the requirement for vaccinated passengers on planes and trains only got lifted in October 2022 after a summer that could have been very successful for the industry. How bad of an impact did those mandates have? And let's start with that.
Well, they were central to our industry being closed for that period of time. I think all Canadians, believe that many of those restrictions were a requirement at the time with COVID, and we certainly supported them. We did what we needed to do to keep Canadians safe. You are correct that Canada did open later than some other countries. And in our sector, that's why we were last to market to hire people back. That's why many of our employees shifted to other sectors that were open over that time period. Other countries also did open before Canada, and so that has also put us at a competitive disadvantage because they are way ahead of us in terms of investing in their tourism growth strategies to the tune of in France $2 billion over 3 years, Australia $1.2 billion, Spain $1.6 billion in euros. So there is a wonderful moment here for Canada to rebuild our tourism sector that was deeply devastated at a time when demand for Canada is at an all-time high. Those investments would be also worthwhile when we think about the looming recession. And historic data would show that the tourism and hospitality sector is effectively recession-proof in the sense that it's not one of the things that gets cut. And so as we are looking at a recession and we are an industry that is poised for growth, we are truly hoping that the government does make the kinds of investments that we need to see to build the next Fogo Island Inn and to invest in those attractions so that we can welcome the world to Canada and meet our growth potential.
Do you have numbers on how much loss was taken, especially last year in the summer, by people not wanting to come to Canada or couldn't get into Canada because of those restrictions?
So last summer, the sort of recovery was driven by the revenge travel was driven by domestic. So we really just had Canadians circling around Canada. Our international visitation measured by spend was down by 45%. over the summer period where we would have normally had. So we did have some traffic come back, particularly our U.S. visitors who would come over. We call rubber tire traffic and get in the car. But we did miss out on the international visitor last summer for sure. And we've also had impacts on those big global events that would come to Canada, who looked at Canada and just said, this is, we're not open for business over that time period. And that's why in our recommendations, we have put a bid fund so that we can attract back some of those major events that have overlooked Canada in recent years.
Thank you.
Now over to the Liberals, MP Chatel for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, c'est un plaisir, évidemment.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see all my colleagues here at the Finance Committee. And it's very difficult to hear what you said, Ms. Greenall. You have reminded us of the difficulties we've experienced over the past 2 years. And for your members here in Ottawa, in the tourism sector, you had to deal with the convoy as well, making their lives much more difficult. So I heard from some of your members who said that it was very difficult and to work in the tourism sector here in Ottawa. But thank you for coming here. Thank you for coming here with your confidence, with your energy, and your desire to get through the difficult times. And you talked a great deal about innovation, and I hope you're going to be able to inspire my Conservative colleagues who have stopped believing in our beautiful country. They don't believe in the resilience of Canadians, so I hope that you'll be able to inspire my colleagues who said that he has lost confidence in Canadians, but not me. I think that Canada is positioned in a good spot. We have everything to be an active player in tomorrow's economy, and we have individuals, natural resources, democracy. And I'd like to hear what Mr. Bergen was referring to. You talked, we're a pillar in the Canadian economy. And so thank you very much for your proposals with respect to fish, Mr. Lansbury, and proteins. My question is for Ms. Verwey. You said earlier that the Clean Technology Program in agriculture was a great program for our farmers to allow them to participate in the future economy. You had recommendations that you wanted to make. Perhaps there are some that you didn't submit it in writing. Perhaps you could explain them to us and then later on provide them to us in writing.
Yes, thank you. I thank you again for the expansion of that fund for clean tech. It's quite limiting in the amount of money that is available, in that smaller operations were not able to access the funds due to, I guess, the stopgap on I guess looking at larger operations, larger applications in that. But I certainly could provide additional information as to the number that wouldn't be able to access that. Even the large scale of operation, modest scale that we have, there's certainly a large number of operations that would fall below the 10,000 acres where you would, incorporate maybe a larger grain handling operation, grain drying operation. So I think there's definitely a gap there where a number of smaller operations would not have been able to access and take advantage of making some of those technical, advances in their operation to make them more technical going forward.
Merci beaucoup. Et si vous pourriez nous les soumettre.
Thank you. And could you submit your recommendations in writing by the end of the week so we could use them? Because this is a great program and I want it to work for all farmers. Ms. Grinnell, earlier in your presentation, you talked about the foreign worker program, and you talked about the complexities of this program, especially for small businesses. I have a great deal of hope for this program. And I'm also confident in the Trusted Employer program. I've seen your recommendations, but do you have any more specific recommendations? And why, in your opinion, do you think that you should have automatic acceptance for your sector? And if you don't have time to complete your answer, please send it to the committee in writing. Thank you.
A few seconds.
Yes.
Okay. We have very technical recommendations that we would be happy to provide the committee on this front. I do want to acknowledge the government's shift on that program to prioritize our sector as having now allowed 30% of our workforce. I will say we have never ever gotten there because of processing, but we have very technical recommendations on how we could do that, and it does include Trusted Employer, because at the end of the day we know that protecting international workers coming into this country is a priority. Our hope is that they come in, they build a life in Canada, and we are a large employer of new Canadians, and we take great pride in supporting new Canadians. Whether they've got language skills or they don't, they can find a home in the hotel industry.
That was quick with those seconds, and thank you, MP Chatel. Now moving to the block, MP Saint-Marie, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mueller, with respect to your requests, everything's been noted, and we do need a global strategy for this sector right across the country, as other countries have. We know that in the aerospace sector, the certification capacity is an important issue. Right now, has Transport Canada got this capacity? And if not, what needs to be done?
For the question.
Thank you for your question.
And a great concern that we do have. Transport Canada certification is an absolute crown jewel in Canada, and it really contributes to our competitive advantage internationally. If we can build the plane here, which we can, we're one of the few nations that can build a plane from scratch, which is something we should be celebrating. And a big part of that is Transport Canada being able to certify those planes and the parts that go on planes and things like this. And as the industry is committed to net zero goals, we were signatories to the net zero action plan from Transport Canada. We see new emerging technologies, autonomous that's out there. We see the funding that is coming through on the ISED side also through innovation. But as we innovate and as we look towards the sustainable future of airspace, we really need Transport Canada to keep pace, to maintain that competitive advantage that we do have here nationally and the international global competitiveness. I just wanted to mention, just going back to the luxury tax, if you'll indulge me, just on that particular piece, I forgot to note that the U.S. had introduced a similar luxury tax in 1991, and they repealed it in 1993. So I'm hoping that 2023, 30 years later, we could see aircraft being removed from that luxury tax here in Canada also. Hopefully we've learned something in 30 years.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
MP Saint-Marie, and now to MP Green, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. And certainly lots of interesting interventions in pre-budget discussions. And I'm going to continue on, of course, with my exchange with Campaign 2000. Ms. Sarangi, thank you for taking the time to present the committee. The work you do is so important for vulnerable Canadians across the country. And as you mentioned, a CERB low-income repayment amnesty is one of your budget asks, but you have more suggestions for the government, and you mentioned some of those in your opening statements. So I'm hoping that you can use the remainder of my time to highlight what those are and why those matter for vulnerable people across the country. I should say for people made vulnerable by bad fiscal policy across the country.
Thank you. And yes, I agree that vulnerable people are valuable, and they are made vulnerable by the systems that we have in place. And policy systems are a choice, so we can choose different and better. One of the recommendations that I do want to highlight that we have put in our submission and described in our submission in detail is a supplement to the Canada Child Benefit. We know that the Canada Child Benefit worked to reach families and children in poverty when it was first implemented, but there has not been an increase into that benefit into the base amount. So our annual research is showing that it's stagnating. It's losing its power to reach children, especially those who are in deep poverty, those families who are on social and disability assistance programs. The child benefit is not reaching those families, even with it being indexed to inflation. It's just flatlined now. So a supplement targeted towards those families would drastically, immediately reduce rates of child poverty. And then the other recommendation I will quickly highlight is that anybody who does not file an personal income tax form does not get any benefits. And oftentimes they are very marginalized. A report last year from the Auditor General found that CRA struggles to reach hard to reach. They've called them hard to reach people. So we are asking the federal government to research and pilot a parallel cash transfers program that works through community-based organizations such as Campaign 2000 members who have relationships in communities with these folks to get cash benefits to people who are left outside of the personal income tax system. In our submission, we also have recommendations around affordable housing, full pharmacare that includes Medicare and vision, access to childcare, and we're building out a system. So right now, a national system. So making sure that childcare is affordable to people who really can't pay $10 a day, but that there's a $0 to $10 a day sliding scale fee. And it's all written out in our budget submission to you.
MP Green, and now to the Conservatives, MP Morantz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To our fine representatives here from CAP, Ms. Verhey and Mr. Hornby. As I said earlier, we've got a kind of the perfect storm of bad news. We've got made in Canada inflation. We have made in Canada high interest rates. We have a punishing carbon tax that the government wants to triple, and excessive regulations around fertilizer. So there's so much ground to cover, and I only have a couple of minutes. But first, I guess my first question is, don't your members just wish government will get out of the way and let farmers do what they do best, grow food and feed the world?
Thank you for that comment. And yes, I think the sentiment of majority or all producers is that what we're doing is something we have a lot of passion for, and we do it well. We do it efficiently, and we certainly do it sustainably because we want to ensure that the next generation is here to farm in the future. And the majority of these regulations, a lot of them that have been imposed, do hinder our ability to do that as being price takers in the market. And without a strong bottom line, we don't have money to invest and innovate and to ensure that we have a future for our children and the next generation.
Thank you. And the carbon tax in particular, I wonder if you could comment on it. I know it's been particularly punishing to small family farm corporations, and now the government is the Trudeau Liberals are planning on tripling it on April 1st. Can you give some examples of the real-life impacts on farm families of having to deal with this inequitable and unfair tax that they do not receive a climate action incentive for within their corporation?
I think the one thing to emphasize is that the tax was put in place to change behavior and to discourage consumption of carbon-based products. The two things that we've highlighted or have been highlighted in Bills 234 in regards to natural gas and propane use are two things that are needed on the farming operation, on our operations that we can't change. Care of our animals and drying of grain are two things that have to be done on our operation. And unfortunately, with the carbon pricing in place, that does pose inevitable and additional costs on a farming operation that is just one more thing adding an expense to our bottom line and reducing the amount of money that we have available to make any further changes or innovation on our farming operation, and just continuing to do our daily operations.
Just briefly, do you think it's a bit of a mixed message when the government is asking on one hand for farmers to reduce their emissions from the use of fertilizer, but on the other hand to be asking for increased production to meet global food security?
Certainly, the efficiency on that end, it is mixed messages. It's telling us to reduce on one hand and then increase production in the case of food security. I think going forward, I think that the one thing that has missed is that the efficiency of farming operations currently, and that we are doing a good job. There's a lot of farmers that have made changes in their operation, and simply, we're not being acknowledged for those changes and the efficiency that we have currently. And to ask for further reduction, inevitably, with that reduction, it will have a negative impact on the yields and the produce that we have. I'm just wondering maybe if Colin at this time has something more to add.
Yeah, thanks, Jill, and Mr. Chair, thank you. So just going back to one of the things that Jill had mentioned regarding being price takers, and when you look at the carbon tax in other businesses, you can, if your input costs go up, you can pass along your cost to the consumer. But in the situation we have with producers, they're unable to do that. So it really just affects them, and it's less capital they have to invest in their business. And with, we have 1 in 8 Canadians working in agriculture. There's a lot of different jobs that are out there. Whether you're in a city riding or you're in a rural area, you have people, working on farm, you have agronomists, things like that. You have folks working in financial services who are selling products to farmers. So, every dollar that they have to put into their business that they aren't intending to spend, that's one less dollar they can spend on economic activity to support other Canadian jobs. So agriculture really does matter to everybody, regardless of where you live. And that's kind of the message we want to make sure that gets taken away from this.
Much. That is your time, MP Morantz. Thank you for that. And now we're moving over to the Liberals. No pressure, MP Baker, but you are the last questioner, and the last questioner before as we'll move into recommendations for our pre-budget consultation. So 5 minutes, please.
I appreciate that, Chair, and I think you and I think one of our witnesses talked about how you always save the best for last. So I really didn't appreciate it.
Wow, you agree with that?
So they said it, I didn't. So I'd like to start by coming back to you, Ms. Greinall, and the exchange that you had with my colleague, Ms. Chattel, about the labor shortage that your members are facing, and of course, this is a challenge in your sector. It's a challenge in a number of sectors, of course. And what I took away, and again, similar to my last exchange with you, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I want to make sure I'm clear and clearly understand, so I can take that back to our minister and into our report writing. Is what I hear you saying about the temporary foreign worker program is that conceptually, broadly, the scope is the right scope, but that there are some specific elements of that program in terms of how quickly people get approved and the execution of that program that you're recommending be changed so that we can get folks here faster, more people here faster. Is that a fair summary of what you're saying?
It's a little more involved than that. What we're recommending is that we build a dedicated stream through the temporary foreign worker program for tourism and hospitality. What that means is that we will have predictability that we can get workers in to meet the summer demand. Because we have year-round jobs, and so we have recommendations on the permanent economic immigration stream, but we will still have temporary need in the sector, and that's really where that program comes into play. Right now, you apply, you have no idea when you're going to be getting. It's cumbersome, it's expensive. It's more the predictability piece that we're really asking for. We are unique in the sense that we have one high season. It comes every summer. This is not a surprise, and so we're hoping that we can get a dedicated stream, at least temporarily, so that we can at least get to this summer period and capitalize on what will be in intense demand for Canada. We liken it to a human body that was healthy, that then went into a 2-year induced coma. And then it comes out and it's missing limbs because we no longer have a workforce. But we're being asked to run a marathon because demand for Canada is at an all-time high. So we want to get to that demand, but we are looking for the lowest hanging fruit to help us get there. And so we've got a sequence of recommendations in place. The temporary foreign worker program is a part of it. We're asking for a dedicated stream, at least in the short term, to help us save the summer, and in the short term to help us deal with what is going to be a 360,000 person shortfall in our sector. That's 2 to 3 times higher than any other sector, and it's not a problem we can solve ourselves.
Thank you for that clarification. I really appreciate that, and that's constructive input. So thank you. Also, on when I think about your sector, I mean you're representing the Hotel Association, but when I think about the tourism sector, there's an ecosystem. There's hotels are part of that ecosystem or that value chain of tourism, but there are other aspects of that. And when I think about this sector, I think about, part of what's foundational to your success or your member success is sort of a strong economy, attractions that are supported in the various jurisdictions in which your members operate, et cetera. Can you talk about, are in those other elements of the value chain where that need to prosper so that your members can prosper, are those in that aspect of the sector, are the necessary investments happening? What more needs to be done, either from the private sector side or the government side, to make sure that that the whole sector is prospering and therefore that your members are prospering?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. The tourism growth strategy that we've been working on in consultation, not just with us, but with that ecosystem that you're referring to, we've been working on this for 10 months now alongside our minister and his team. And in that strategy, what we have put forward is investments that could take us from 22 million visitors to 30 million by 2030, $105 billion industry to $134 billion industry. And at the heart of it, it is about the government co-investing alongside other levels of government and industry in building those major attractions and those the convention centers and the Fogo Island Inns that we need to be able to capitalize on that. If we build it, they will come, and this is the moment for us to make those investments. In addition to that, we're looking for marketing dollars so we can continue to tell our story. Business events is going to be important because we, as to a previous question, we lost some ground there. But central to all of this is making sure that we've got a workforce in the first place to be able to meet the demand we have in Canada even today. And so with all of those pieces in play, that will create the demand drivers for people to come. And of course, from a hotel perspective, we want to make sure that we have enough hotel capacity in this country at the same time. And so we have recommended a credit facility so we can keep up with construction. We're at less than 1% of growth today in terms of the capacity that we have. We are short capacity. For example, in Calgary, we're 3,000 rooms short today. And so we need to be investing not just in the demand drivers, but the associated capacity that would come with it. And that's all being outlined in the tourism growth strategy. And we're hoping for something meaningful here. We're hoping that we can compete with other countries who are investing in the billions into this strategy and not into the low hundreds of millions. So thank you for the question.
And thank you, MP Baker. And as we conclude this meeting, we want to thank, our witnesses. This is our final meeting of pre-budget consultation with witnesses, and we want to thank you for your testimony. Thank all the witnesses that have come before our committee in this pre-budget consultation, as well as the many submissions that we received from organizations and individuals. I think 700 plus. I'm looking to the analysts. The members now from this point will be looking at all those recommendations and be constructing the report of course, with the assistance of the analysts who do a lot of the heavy lifting here for us and the clerk. And we want to thank all the staff, the interpreters, everybody that has helped us throughout this process. So thank you very much, everyone. And on behalf of the Members Finance Committee, this will conclude our meeting. Thank you. We're adjourned.